Jake Harrison stood in the middle of the Great Hall on the space station orbiting Xarian Prime. The room was huge and filled with strange beings from different worlds. Some looked like walking crystals that sparkled in the light. Others had blue skin and gills like fish. There were also tall green creatures that looked like they were made of tree bark and leaves. Jake was the only human in the room. The crystal beings were called Cathari. They were the ones who had called this meeting. Their leader was tall and had sharp edges all over his body. His name was Vexstar, and when he spoke his voice sounded like wind blowing through a cave. The blue fish-like aliens were Neptari, and they lived in water worlds. The green tree people were Verdans, and they came from forest planets. Jake felt nervous, but he tried not to show it. He was here to represent all humans. The other aliens were deciding if humans could join their group called the Galactic Survival Alliance. This was a big deal because only the toughest species in the galaxy were allowed to join. Vexstar stepped forward and his crystal body caught the light from the ceiling. "Human Jake Harrison," he said in his strange voice, "your species wants to join our alliance, but we have doubts. Humans are weak compared to us. You cannot breathe water like the Neptari. You cannot live in trees for years like the Verdans. You cannot survive in deserts like we Cathari can." The other aliens nodded their heads or made sounds that meant they agreed. Jake could feel them all looking at him. Some seemed curious, but others looked like they thought humans were not good enough for their group. "We have a test," Vexstar continued. "It is called the Proving Grounds. Every species that wants to join our alliance must pass this test. But no species except us Cathari has ever survived it." A Neptari with dark blue skin spoke up. Her voice bubbled like water. "The test is on the desert moon below us. It is the hottest and driest place we know. There is no water anywhere. The temperature goes up to 140 degrees during the day and drops to freezing at night." One of the Verdans added in a voice like rustling leaves, "We tried. The test 50 years ago, our best warrior died in 6 hours. The Neptari tried it 20 years ago. Their champion lasted only 4 hours before the heat killed him." Vexstar smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "The rules are simple. You must survive for 48 hours. That is 2 full days and nights. You cannot bring any tools or machines or weapons. You can only wear basic clothes. No one can help you. If you die, then humans can never ask to join our alliance again." Jake thought about this. 48 hours in a desert with no water and no tools sounded impossible. But he knew that humans had survived in deserts on Earth for thousands of years. Maybe they could do something the other aliens could not think of. "What happens if I survive?" Jake asked. "Then humans will be welcomed into our alliance as equals," Vexstar said, "but this will not happen. Even we Cathari need special body parts to survive in our desert. We can pull water from the air itself. Our skin is like armor against the heat. What do humans have?" Jake looked around the room. He saw Dr. Lisa Carter watching him from the human section. She was a scientist who had studied alien biology for years. Next to her was Pete Rogers, who was an engineer and had designed many of the human spaceships. Both of them looked worried. Jake thought about all the stories he had heard about human survival. People lost in deserts who found ways to live. Sailors who survived on tiny islands with no fresh water. Mountain climbers who made it through terrible storms. Humans were good at surviving because they could think of new solutions to problems. "I accept your challenge," Jake said loudly, so everyone could hear. The room became very quiet. Even the Cathari seemed surprised that Jake had agreed so quickly. The Neptari made bubbling sounds that meant they were shocked. The Verdans rustled their leaves nervously. Vexstar stepped closer to Jake. "You do not understand, human. This is not a game. The Proving Grounds will kill you. The heat will cook your brain. The cold will freeze your blood. You will die with no water to drink." "Maybe," Jake said, "but humans have something you might not expect. We are very good at finding ways to survive when things look impossible." "Doctor." Carter stood up from her seat. "Jake, you do not have to do this. We can find other ways to prove that humans belong in the alliance." But Jake shook his head. "No, Lisa. This is our chance. If we run away now, they will never respect us. Besides, I have been thinking about this problem and I might have an idea. Pete Rogers also stood up. What idea? Jake, there is no water in that desert. How can you survive without water? Jake smiled for the first time since entering the room. Who says there is no water? Maybe I just need to look for it in a different way. The aliens looked confused by this answer. Vexstar made a sound like breaking glass, which meant he was angry. There is no water in the proving grounds. We made sure of this. We have sensors that can detect even tiny amounts of moisture. The area is completely dry. Then I guess I will have to make my own water, Jake said. This made all the aliens very confused. How could someone make water in a desert? The Cathari had never heard of such a thing. The Neptari knew a lot about water, but even they could not. Imagine making water from nothing. Vexstar decided that the human was either very stupid or very crazy. Very well. We will take you to the proving grounds in 1 hour. You will have 48 hours to survive. When you die, we will collect your body and send it back to your people as a warning. Jake nodded. And when I survive, you will welcome humans into your alliance? The crystal alien made another breaking glass sound. If you survive, human, but you will not. As the meeting ended, Jake walked over to Dr. Carter and Pete Rogers. They both looked very worried about what he had just agreed to do. Jake, this is suicide, Lisa said quietly. The heat alone will kill you in hours, and without water you have no chance at all. Trust me, Jake said. I have been thinking about human biology, and I think I know something the aliens do not. Humans sweat when we get hot, right? Well, sweat is mostly water. If I can find a way to clean it and make it pure again, then maybe I can survive. Pete looked at him like he was crazy. You want to drink your own sweat? That sounds disgusting and dangerous. It is dangerous, Jake agreed, but it might be the only way. The aliens think humans are weak because we are not built for extreme environments like they are. But maybe our weakness can become our strength if we are smart about it. The transport ship was small and cramped. Jake sat in the passenger seat while a Cathari pilot flew them down to the desert moon. Through the window, Jake could see the surface getting closer. It looked like a giant sandbox with red and orange sand stretching as far as he could see. There were no plants or trees or any signs of life anywhere. Last chance to change your mind, human, the pilot said in the typical crystal voice of his people. Once I drop you off, there is no going back. The next ship will come in 48 hours to collect either you or your dead body. Jake looked out at the harsh landscape below. The twin suns of this solar system were both shining down on the desert. Even from space he could see heat waves rising from the sand. I am ready, he said. The ship landed with a soft thud on a flat area surrounded by tall rock formations. The pilot opened the door and immediately hot air rushed into the cabin. It felt like opening an oven. Jake could already feel sweat starting to form on his forehead. The temperature out there is 135 degrees right now. The pilot said in 3 hours, when both suns are directly overhead, it will reach 140. Tonight it will drop to 20 degrees. Good luck, human. You will need it. Jake stepped out of the ship and immediately felt like he had walked into a wall of heat. The air was so hot it hurt to breathe. His clothes stuck to his body as sweat began pouring from his skin. Behind him he heard the ship taking off, and soon it was just a small dot in the sky. He was alone. Jake looked around at his new environment. The ground was covered in red sand that was already burning his feet through his shoes. Tall rocks stuck up from the sand like broken teeth. The sky was a strange orange color because of the twin suns. There was no shade anywhere except for small shadows behind some of the rocks. The first thing Jake did was find the biggest rock shadow he could. The shade was not much cooler, but at least the suns were not beating directly on his head. He sat down on the hot sand and tried to think clearly despite the heat. Already his shirt was soaked with sweat. He could feel water dripping down his back and chest. His body was trying to cool itself by sweating, but in this dry heat the sweat evaporated almost immediately. This was good for cooling, but bad because he was losing water very quickly. Jake knew that a normal human could only survive about 3 days without water. In this heat he would probably die much sooner, maybe in 12 hours or less. Unless he could find a way to replace the water he was losing through sweat, he pulled out a small device from his pocket. It was not really a tool since it was just a basic sensor that could measure temperature and humidity. The aliens had allowed him to keep it since it could not help him survive. The device showed that the temperature was now 138 degrees. The humidity was less than 5%, which meant the air was extremely dry. Jake started walking around his small shaded area looking for anything that might help him. The sand was just sand with nothing else mixed in. The rocks were hard and dry with no cracks that might hold water. There were no plants or insects or any living things at all. As he explored, Jake kept sweating more and more. His shirt was now completely soaked and water was dripping from his hair. He realized that in just the first hour he had probably lost more than a cup of water through sweating. At this rate he would be dead by nightfall, but Jake had an idea that he had been thinking about since accepting the challenge. Human sweat was mostly water with some salt and other chemicals mixed in. If he could somehow separate the water from everything else, then he might be able to drink it. The question was how to do this with no tools or equipment. Jake remembered lessons from his high school science classes about distillation. When you heat up dirty water, the clean water turns into steam. If you cool the steam back down, it becomes pure water again, while the dirt and chemicals get left behind. Maybe he could use the extreme heat of this desert to help him distill his own sweat. He started taking off his shirt. The hot air hit his bare chest like a slap, but he ignored the discomfort. Jake tore his shirt into long strips using his teeth and fingernails. The fabric was thin and would work well for what he had in mind. Next, Jake looked for rocks that had the right shape. He needed flat ones that could hold water and pointed ones that could help direct steam. After searching for 20 minutes, he found what he was looking for. 3 flat rocks that could work like shallow bowls and several pointed rocks of different sizes. Jake began building his water distillation system. He placed one flat rock in direct sunlight where it would get as hot as possible. This would be his evaporation dish. He soaked one strip of his shirt with sweat by rubbing it all over his sweating chest and arms. Then he laid the wet fabric on the hot rock. Above this, he arranged the pointed rocks to create a slanted surface. He covered this with another piece of his shirt fabric. The idea was that when the sweat evaporated from the bottom cloth, it would hit the top cloth and cool down back into water. The slanted rocks would make the clean water drip down into a collection area. For the collection area, Jake used his 3rd flat rock. He positioned it carefully so that water dripping from the top cloth would land in the rock bowl. The whole system looked like a tiny tent made of rocks and fabric. While Jake worked on his distillation system, the heat kept getting worse. Both suns were now almost directly overhead, and the temperature had reached 140 degrees, just like the pilot had warned. Jake felt dizzy and his vision was starting to blur from the heat and dehydration, but his system was starting to work. Water was evaporating from the bottom cloth and condensing on the top cloth. Tiny drops of clean water were beginning to drip into his collection rock. It was not much water, but it was definitely working. Jake sat in the small shade next to his water maker and tried to stay cool. Every few minutes he would soak another piece of shirt fabric with fresh sweat and add it to the evaporation rock. The sun was doing most of the work by providing intense heat to turn the sweat into steam. As the day went on, Jake's distillation system produced small amounts of clean water. It was not enough to replace all the water he was losing through continued sweating, but it was better than nothing. The water tasted strange, but it was not salty like sweat. The distillation process was working to remove the salt and other chemicals. By late afternoon, Jake had collected about half a cup of clean water. He drank it slowly, trying to make it last as long as possible. It helped, but he was still getting more dehydrated as time passed. His head hurt and his mouth felt like cotton. As the suns began to set, the temperature started dropping quickly. Jake put his remaining shirt pieces back on to stay warm. Soon it would be night and the temperature would drop all the way to freezing. He would have to survive the cold as well as find a way to collect more water for tomorrow. Jake gathered dry sand around his body to help insulate against the coming cold. His water distillation system would not work at night without the sun to provide heat. But he had proven that his idea could work. If he could improve the system tomorrow, he might actually have a chance to survive the full 48 hours. As darkness fell, Jake huddled against his rock shelter. The temperature was dropping fast, and soon he was shivering instead of sweating. Above him, the alien stars looked down on one human trying to do what no other species had ever done in this deadly desert. Tomorrow would be the real test of whether human cleverness could overcome impossible odds. The cold hit Jake like a giant ice cube. In just a few hours, the temperature had dropped from 140 degrees to below freezing. His teeth chattered and his whole body shook as he tried to stay warm against the rocks. The sand that had been burning hot during the day was now cold enough to freeze his skin. Jake had wrapped himself in the remaining pieces of his torn shirt, but it was not enough. The thin fabric could not keep out the bitter cold. He tried digging into the sand to make a shelter, but the sand was loose and kept falling back on him. After 2 hours of shivering, Jake realized he might freeze to death before the sun came up again, but then Jake remembered something from his survival training. Body heat could be trapped and saved if you knew how to do it right. He started gathering the driest sand he could find and piled it all around his body. Then he pulled more sand over himself like a blanket. The sand was cold at first, but slowly it began to warm up from his body heat. This trick worked better than Jake had hoped. The sand acted like insulation and kept his body heat from escaping into the night air. He was still cold, but he was not freezing anymore. Now he could think about other problems instead of just trying not to die from the cold. The biggest problem was water. During the day, his sweat distillation system had produced some clean water, but not nearly enough. Jake had calculated that. He was losing about 2 cups of water per hour through sweating. His system had only produced about half a cup in the entire afternoon. If he could not improve it tomorrow, he would still die from dehydration. Jake spent the long cold hours thinking about how to make his water system work better. The basic idea was good, but the design needed improvements. He needed a way to collect more sweat and a better way to turn it into clean water. Maybe he could use more rocks and fabric to build a bigger system. As Jake thought about water distillation, he also thought about the aliens watching him from space. They probably expected him to be dead by now. The Cathari had said that no other species had ever survived more than 6 hours in the proving grounds. Jake had already made it through 12 hours and he was still alive, but being alive and surviving were 2 different things. Jake knew that tomorrow would be much harder than today. He would start the day already dehydrated and weak. The heat would be just as bad as today, but his body would be in worse condition to handle it. Unless his water system worked much better, he would not make it to the end of the 48 hours. When the first sun began to rise, Jake felt both relief and dread. Relief because he had survived the freezing night. Dread because he knew the coming day would be a fight for his life. He climbed out of his sand blanket and immediately felt the air starting to warm up. Jake looked at his water distillation system from yesterday. The rocks were still in place, but the fabric was dry. During the night, all the water had either evaporated or soaked into the ground. He would have to start over with collecting sweat and rebuilding his system, but Jake had new ideas for improving the design. Yesterday, he had only used 3 rocks and 2 pieces of fabric. Today he would build something much bigger and more efficient. He started gathering every piece of fabric he could find from his torn shirt. Then he began looking for more rocks of different shapes and sizes. Jake found that some rocks had natural bowl shapes that could hold more water. Other rocks were very flat and would heat up quickly in the sun. He also found some rocks that had smooth surfaces that would be good for condensing steam back into water. It took him 2 hours, but Jake managed to collect enough materials to build a much better distillation system. The new system was 3 times bigger than yesterday's version. Jake arranged 5 flat rocks in the sun as evaporation dishes. Above each dish, he built a slanted roof made of fabric and pointed rocks. All the roofs drained into 3 collection bowls that could hold much more water than his single bowl from yesterday. As the temperature climbed, Jake began soaking fabric pieces with his sweat and placing them on the hot rocks. The twin suns were rising toward their midday position, and soon the rocks would be hot enough to boil water. Jake's body was already producing plenty of sweat to feed into his system, but Jake realized he had another problem. Yesterday he had been able to stay in shade while his system worked. Today his bigger system took up all the available shade. If he sat in the sun, he would overheat and sweat even more. But if he moved away from his system, he could not tend it properly. Jake decided to solve this problem by making himself part of the system. He positioned himself so that his body provided shade for the collection bowls while his head and shoulders were in direct sunlight. This way the collection area stayed cool while his body heated up and produced more sweat to feed the evaporation dishes. This arrangement worked much better than Jake had expected. His body became like a human sweat factory. The heat made him sweat constantly, and he could use every drop to feed his distillation system. At the same time, his body blocked the sun from heating up the collection bowls too much, which helped keep the condensed water from evaporating again. As the morning progressed, Jake's improved system began producing clean water much faster than yesterday. Instead of a few drops per hour, he was getting a steady stream of clean water dripping into his collection bowls. The larger evaporation area and better condensation surfaces were making a big difference. By noon, Jake had already collected more water than he had managed in the entire previous day. His collection bowls were half full of clean water that had started as salty sweat but was now pure enough to drink. Jake allowed himself to drink one full bowl to help fight his dehydration. The water tasted better today than yesterday. Jake's improved system was doing a better job of removing the salt and other chemicals from his sweat. The water was still warm and had a slight metallic taste from the rocks, but it was definitely safe to drink. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, Jake's system went into high production. The evaporation rocks were now hot enough to make the sweat boil, which created more steam for condensation. Jake was sweating so much that he could barely keep up with soaking new fabric pieces and adding them to the evaporation dishes, but the improved system was keeping up with his water loss for the first time. Jake calculated that he was now producing almost as much clean water as he was losing through continued sweating. If he could maintain this balance, he might actually survive until tomorrow. The alien observers in space were amazed by what they were seeing. No species had ever lasted this long in the proving grounds. Even more surprising was Jake's method of survival. The idea of using sweat as a water source was completely foreign to all the alien species. They had never seen anything like it. Vexstar, the Cathari leader, was especially confused. His species could absorb water directly from the air, but they had never thought about recycling water that their bodies had already used. The concept of turning waste back into something useful was a very human way of thinking. As the second day wore on, Jake continued to improve his system. He found ways to make the collection more efficient and discovered that certain rocks worked better than others for different parts of the process. By evening, his water production was actually exceeding his water loss. For the first time since arriving in the desert, Jake was gaining water instead of losing it. When the suns began to set, Jake had 3 full bowls of clean water stored up. This was more than enough to get him through the cold night and into the final day of the challenge. He had proven that his crazy idea could actually work. Now he just had to survive one more night and one more day to complete the 48-hour challenge. The second night was different from the first. Jake still had to deal with the freezing cold, but now he had water to drink. 3 bowls of clean water sat next to him as he buried himself in sand for warmth. Having water made everything better. His headache was gone and his thinking was much clearer, but Jake knew that the final day would be his biggest test yet. His body had been pushed to its limits for almost 40 hours. Even though he had water, his energy was very low. The constant heat and cold and stress were wearing him down. Tomorrow he would need to operate his distillation system for one more full day while his body got weaker and weaker. During the night, Jake planned improvements for his system. He had learned a lot in the past day about which rocks worked best and how to arrange the fabric for maximum efficiency. Tomorrow, he would build the best version yet of his sweat-powered water maker. Jake also thought about the aliens watching him from space. By now, they must be very surprised that he was still alive. The Cathari had been so confident that no other species could survive in their desert. But Jake was proving that humans had abilities the aliens had never considered. When morning came, Jake felt tired but determined. He drank one full bowl of water to start the day properly hydrated. Then he began dismantling his system so he could rebuild it even better than before. This would be his final chance to prove that human intelligence could overcome impossible odds. Jake had discovered during the night that some of his rocks had small cracks and holes that trapped water. He could use these natural features to create better collection systems. He also realized that he could stack rocks in layers to create multiple condensation surfaces. This would give him much more area for turning steam back into water. The new system took Jake 3 hours to build, but it was his masterpiece. He had created a complex network of evaporation dishes, condensation surfaces, and collection areas that could process huge amounts of sweat into clean water. The system looked like a miniature city made of rocks and fabric. As the twin suns climbed higher, Jake fired up his water factory. His body immediately began producing sweat in the growing heat. But now Jake had learned to work with his body's natural cooling system instead of fighting against it. The more he sweated, the more raw material he had for making clean water. Jake had also figured out how to position himself for maximum efficiency. He lay down so that his back was in direct sunlight while his front was shaded by his rock system. This created the perfect conditions for heavy sweating while keeping the collection areas cool. Jake became a human solar, still powered by his own body heat and sweat. The improved system worked better than Jake had dared to hope. Within 2 hours, he had already replaced all the water he had drunk that morning. By noon, he had more clean water than he could drink. His collection bowls were overflowing, and he had to build additional storage areas to hold all the water his system was producing, but the success came with a price. Jake's body was working overtime to produce enough sweat to feed his massive distillation system. The constant sweating was exhausting, and his energy levels were dropping fast. He felt dizzy and weak, even though he had plenty of water to drink. The alien observers were recording everything with amazement. Jake's final system was producing clean water at a rate that seemed impossible. He was taking a bodily waste product and turning it into life-saving drinking water using nothing but rocks, fabric, and solar heat. No alien species had ever conceived of such a solution. Dr. Lisa Carter watched from the observation ship with tears in her eyes. She could see that Jake was pushing his body beyond safe limits, but she also knew he was making history. If he survived, the next few hours he would prove that humans deserved respect throughout the galaxy. Pete Rogers was busy calculating water production rates and efficiency numbers. According to his measurements, Jake's system was now producing water faster than a small desalination plant. The fact that it was powered entirely by human sweat and solar energy made it even more impressive. As the day progressed, Jake's physical condition continued to decline. He was producing clean water, but his body was running out of energy to keep going. His hands shook as he tended his system, and his vision kept blurring from exhaustion. Several times he almost passed out from the heat and strain, but Jake's water production kept increasing. His system had become so efficient that it was pulling every possible drop of water from his sweat. The condensation surfaces were working perfectly, and the collection areas were filling faster than he could empty them. By mid-afternoon, Jake had produced more than 2 gallons of clean water. This was far more than he needed for survival, but it proved beyond any doubt that his method worked. He had turned the desert's greatest threat into his salvation by using human ingenuity and determination. The Cathari leader Vextar was in shock. His species had ruled the desert for thousands of years, but they had never seen anything like what Jake was doing. The human was not just surviving in the proving grounds, he was thriving. His water system was producing enough clean water to supply a small group of people. As the afternoon wore on, Jake realized he had won. With just a few hours left until the 48-hour deadline, he had more than enough water to finish the challenge. His system was still producing clean water faster than he could drink it. He had proven that human creativity could overcome even the most impossible survival situations, but Jake was barely conscious from exhaustion. His body had given everything it had to make his survival system work. He lay in the shade of his rock construction drinking clean water that had come from his own sweat. His breathing was shallow and his heart was beating too fast, but he was alive and he was winning. The alien observers prepared for the final phase of the challenge. In just a few more hours, the transport ship would return to collect Jake. If he was still alive, he would become the first non-Cathari to survive the proving grounds. More importantly, he would prove that humans had earned their place among the galaxy's greatest survivors. Jake used his remaining energy to keep his system running until the very end. Even though he no longer needed the water, he wanted to demonstrate the full capability of his invention. The aliens needed to see that humans could not only survive impossible situations, but could actually turn those situations to their advantage. As the suns began to set on Jake's final day in the desert, his water production system was still going strong. He had created something that would be remembered throughout the galaxy as one of the greatest survival innovations ever developed. Using nothing but human sweat, desert rocks, torn fabric, and pure determination, Jake had conquered the unconquerable desert. The final night in the desert was the longest of Jake's life. He lay wrapped in sand with his water bowls beside him, knowing that he had done the impossible. In just a few hours, the transport ship would arrive to collect him. If he could survive, until then, he would become the first non-Cathari to complete the Proving Grounds challenge. Jake's body was exhausted, but his mind was clear. He had more than enough water to last through the night and into the morning. His sweat distillation system had produced far more clean water than he needed. Even if something went wrong with his system, he had enough stored water to survive several more days. But Jake was not just thinking about survival anymore. He was thinking about what his success would mean for humanity. If he completed this challenge, humans would be accepted into the Galactic Survival Alliance as equals. No alien species would ever again question whether humans belonged among the galaxy's toughest survivors. As Jake waited for dawn, he thought about all the humans throughout history who had survived impossible situations. Explorers who crossed frozen wastelands, sailors who survived months at sea, people who lived through disasters and wars and famines. The same human spirit that had carried those people through their trials had helped Jake survive in this alien desert. When the first sun appeared on the horizon, Jake felt a mixture of relief and pride. He had made it through 48 hours in the deadliest environment the Cathari could devise. More than that, he had thrived. His water system was still producing clean drinking water, even though he no longer needed it. Jake spent his final hours in the desert making sure his system would keep working even after he left. He wanted the aliens to see exactly how his invention operated. Future visitors to this desert might be able to use his techniques to survive where others had failed. The sound of approaching engines told Jake that his rescue was near. He looked up to see the transport ship coming down from the sky. As it landed near his rock shelter, Jake felt like he was watching the end of a dream. For 2 days, this harsh desert had been his whole world. Now he was going back to the stars. The same Cathari pilot who had dropped him off stepped out of the ship. But this time, the pilot's crystal face showed amazement instead of contempt. "Human Jake Harrison," the pilot said, "you have done something. That should be impossible. How are you still alive?" Jake stood up slowly. His legs were weak and his whole body ached, but he was definitely alive. "I used what I had," he said simply. "Every human has the tools they need to survive. Sometimes you just have to think about them in a new way." The pilot walked over to Jake's water distillation system. The collection bowls were still full of clean water that sparkled in the morning sunlight. "This water came from your own body?" the pilot asked in disbelief. "From my sweat," Jake confirmed. "Human sweat is mostly water with some salt and other chemicals. If you distill it properly, you can drink it safely. The desert heat provided the energy I needed to make it work." The pilot examined the system more closely. He could see how the rocks and fabric worked together to turn sweat into clean water. The design was simple but brilliant. No Cathari has ever thought of such a solution, the pilot admitted. We absorb water from air, but we never considered recycling water from our own bodies. Jake gathered his collection bowls and poured the remaining water onto the sand. He no longer needed it, and he wanted to show that his system had produced far more water than required for survival. The desert tried to kill me by making me sweat, Jake said, so I turned my sweat into my salvation. The flight back to the space station was very different from the trip down to the desert. The Cathari pilot asked many questions about how Jake's system worked. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding human survival techniques. When they reached the station, a crowd of aliens was waiting to greet them. Word of Jake's survival had spread throughout the space station. Aliens from dozens of different species had come to see the human who had conquered the proving grounds. Many of them had never believed that any species except the Cathari could survive in such extreme conditions. Vextar was waiting in the docking bay with the other Alliance leaders. The Cathari commander's crystal face was unreadable, but Jake could sense that something had changed. The contempt and dismissal were gone. In their place was something that looked like respect. Human Jake Harrison, Vextar announced loudly so all the gathered aliens could hear. You have completed the Proving Grounds challenge. In 48 hours you have accomplished what no other species has ever done. You have survived our deadliest test using only human intelligence and determination. The crowd of aliens made various sounds that meant they were impressed. The Neptari bubbled excitedly while the Verdans rustled their leaves in amazement. Species that Jake had never seen before stepped forward to get a closer look at the human who had done the impossible. Dr. Lisa Carter pushed through the crowd and hugged Jake tightly. We were so worried, she said with tears in her eyes. Your vital signs kept getting worse, but somehow you held on. How did you manage to survive? I remembered that humans are good at solving problems, Jake said. The aliens expected me to fight the desert like they would. Instead, I worked with it. I used the heat that was supposed to kill me to power my water system. Pete Rogers was already asking technical questions about the distillation process. The engineering is incredible, he said. You built a solar still using nothing but rocks and fabric. The efficiency rates must have been amazing to produce enough water for survival. Jake smiled tiredly. It worked better than I hoped. And I was producing more clean water than I could drink. The system was so efficient that I could have survived for weeks if necessary. Vextar stepped forward and extended one of his crystal hands toward Jake. On behalf of the Galactic Survival Alliance, I formally welcome humanity as full members. Your species has proven that survival is not just about physical adaptation. Intelligence and creativity are just as important as strength or natural abilities. The crowd erupted in celebration, sounds from dozens of different alien species. Jake had not just survived the proving grounds, he had changed how the entire galaxy thought about survival and adaptation. A Neptari representative spoke up with her bubbling voice. We would like to learn more about human survival techniques. Perhaps our species could share knowledge and help each other in difficult situations. One of the Verdans added, the human solution was completely different from anything we have ever seen. We are interested in studying these creative approaches to survival challenges. Jake realized that his success had opened doors for much more than just Alliance membership. He had started a conversation between species that could lead to new discoveries and better survival methods for everyone. As the celebration continued, Jake thought about his time in the desert. He had gone there to prove that humans deserved respect, but he had learned something more important. Every species had unique abilities and perspectives. By working together and sharing knowledge, they could all become stronger and more capable of surviving whatever challenges the galaxy might present. The proving grounds had tested more than Jake's ability to survive extreme conditions. It had tested his ability to think differently and find solutions where none seemed to exist. That was perhaps the most human trait of all. When faced with impossible odds, humans found ways to make the impossible possible. Jake looked out at the stars through the station windows. Somewhere out there were new worlds and new challenges waiting for humanity and their alien allies. Together, They would explore and survive and thrive in ways that none of them could achieve alone. The desert challenge was over, but the real adventure was just beginning.